All right. So as you all know, because you registered, this is our presentation about the Deason Center's work on prosecutorial declination policies and racial disparity in marijuana prosecutions in Dallas County. But let me tell you a little bit about the Deason Center. Next slide, please. Our areas of focus include the right to counsel and the delivery in particular of indigent defense services, the focus on small, tribal, and rural criminal legal systems. And here our work is primarily in lifting up the topic of rural justice, but also working to address criminal law deserts, places where there are simply too few prosecutors and too few defense providers to meet local needs. And lastly, and what we're here today to talk about, is our work on the use of prosecutorial charging and screening discretion. So let me talk briefly about this project, and then I'll introduce our co-presenters. Next slide, please. So our Dallas partnership is an ongoing relationship with the Dallas County District Attorney's Office. You'll see we have our cute little acronym here, District Attorney Learning and Leadership through Application of Science. We had to do something to come up with an acronym that spelled Dallas. There are three real goals of this project. One is to help ensure equity in what the Dallas County District Attorney's Office is doing. And so we provide some data and some transparency so the office can assess how it's doing in terms of equity. Another goal would include public safety. Other aspects of the project actually deal with the third goal, which is the delivery of due process. But for today's presentation, we're primarily going to focus on the equity component of the work we're doing. And I should note again that all of this occurs in a context in which the District Attorney's Office is deeply invested in transparency. So we have an independent research agreement. We make our independent conclusions. And the District Attorney's Office has said, we want you to publish them. We want you to tell everybody what we're doing, good, bad, and ugly. So with those disclaimers, I want to introduce two of my colleagues who have been working on this. Dr. Victoria Smiegocki is the Assistant Research Director at the Deason Center. She is also parenthetically now a law student, being a glutton for punishment. A PhD was not enough for her. And she did primarily the quantitative analysis in the study, but she's also been working very closely with the District Attorney's Office. Shem Vinton is our policy attorney. He joins us from the Nueces County District Attorney's Office, where among other things, he made charging decisions. Shem is our attorney lead, and he has actually been embedded in the Dallas County District Attorney's Office, observing how lawyers make their charging decisions, et cetera. And while Shem was not involved in observing the marijuana charging decisions at the time, he has been involved in our conversations with the office about how their charging practice works, what their procedures are, and he's got a lot of light to shed on why certain policies may be more effective than others. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the two of them.
All right, thank you, Pam. Again, good afternoon. My name is Shem Vinton, and I'm a policy attorney with the Deason Center. Prior to really getting into the data and the findings from that data, I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on Dallas County and how things work in that office. So this first slide is concerning the Dallas County charging workflow. So what you see in the pictures is depicted that actual workflow. So what happens initially, like in most cases, there's an arrest. And then following the investigation related to that arrest, it'll be referred to the District Attorney's Office. Now, referred can be referral, submitted, delivered to whatever vocabulary you want to use. It's taken to the DA's office for their review. In Dallas County, unlike some other counties that I'm familiar with, they have what they call a quality control unit that actually screens cases prior to going to an attorney. And the quality control unit is actually staffed by legal secretaries who review cases to ensure completeness and to add any information that needs to be added into the case management software that they use in that office. If everything's okay with the case and it's complete, then at that time it's actually submitted to the intake unit, which intake unit, again, is a name that may only be familiar to people in Texas. It could be known as a charging unit, a screening unit in other jurisdictions. But this is a unit of attorneys that are the ones who make charging decisions in Dallas County. Those attorneys will review the case for the elements of the offense, and if it meets the standard of proof that they require in their office, then the case will either be accepted and then be routed to the trial attorneys and the trial courts, or declined or rejected, and the case ends there. And just some background as far as misdemeanors or marijuana misdemeanors in Texas. So these are the two real bases of misdemeanor marijuana charges in Texas. The first one is possession of paraphernalia, which is a Class C misdemeanor, which would be punished in a municipal court and only carries with it a penalty of a fine. But then there are the possession of marijuana offenses in the misdemeanor level. They are either a Class A or a Class B misdemeanor. Class B is punishable up to 180 days in jail, whereas a Class A is punishable up to 1 year in jail. Now, these would be heard in a county court in the state versus the municipal court, like the paraphernalia offense. And these are the two offenses which we're really concerned with. One other note is that in 2007, Texas amended its law related to cite and release. In 2007, legislature allowed for the addition of marijuana offenses to be included in cite and release, but only those pertaining to Class A and Class B misdemeanors. All right, so marijuana misdemeanors in Dallas County. So in 2017, despite the law having existed since 2007, Dallas, the city, went into a system of cite and release for marijuana offenses, at least for misdemeanor offenses. At the time, Faith Johnson was the district attorney for Dallas County. She was appointed by Greg Abbott in 2016 and served 2 full years, 2017 and 2018, in which during her administration, cite and release became the program of the day in the city of Dallas. So these are the numbers related to her tenure as a district attorney. So as it relates to marijuana offense, misdemeanor offenses rather. So in 2017, there were 6,409 new cases of marijuana, misdemeanor marijuana offense referred to her office, and in 2018, 5,600. Of those, 1,407 were deferred in 2017 and 862 in 2018. And this is where things get a little more pertinent, in that the number of dismissals that resulted from those new cases. Now, granted, the new cases don't represent the entire caseload for misdemeanor marijuana offenses in that office. There obviously was a backlog of the cases that carried over from prior years. But even in 2017 and 2018, we're seeing this office dismissing thousands of misdemeanor marijuana offenses. And then, of course, convictions, kind of the same number for convictions in 2017 as dismissals, and you see a decrease in 2018 convictions to dismissals. So the big takeaway from those numbers is that, prior to John Creusot becoming DA in 2019, they're dismissing thousands of marijuana cases and they're receiving thousands of cases from the police. All right, so as far as the timeline, I'm going to run you through a bit of a timeline from when John Creusot took office and to kind of the period of time in which we're studying, or the team studied with respect to the policies that he implemented during his period of time as DA. So in 2018, John Creusot began running for DA, and among the things that he ran on were that he was going to institute reforms in the office related to racial disparity, mass incarceration, and including the marijuana policies that he wanted to start up when he was the DA. He takes office in January 2019 after winning the 2018 election. In February of 2019, he actually sends a memorandum to law enforcement agencies in Dallas County that includes, among them, a declination policies related to misdemeanor marijuana offenses. Now, this is only circulated to the police. In April 11, 2019, he actually has a press release where he discusses these new policies, but it's directed at the citizens of Dallas County. In January 2019, Texas passed or enacted its new hemp law, which the most important change to the law was what hemp was and then what marijuana was. So with the new law that was enacted in that month of June 2019, hemp was any part of the cannabis plant that had a concentration of 0.3% THC or lower. Anything above 0.3% THC was considered marijuana. So marijuana was only a substance of the cannabis plant that had a THC concentration of 0.3% or greater. And in July that same year, 2019, John Crusoe's office sent another memorandum to law enforcement in which he made amendments to his earlier policy and stated that they would not accept any marijuana cases without an accompanying lab report that would evidence that the suspected contraband was in fact marijuana as defined by statute. All right, and I'm going to pass it on to Victoria Smiegocki.
All right, thanks everyone for joining us. So just to get into the nitty gritty of the study that we actually did here, and thanks to Shem for kind of providing that timeline. Now that timeline is really going to be helpful for understanding, one, how we broke down 2019 and understanding what it did, but also in terms of the information we looked at. So Shem, if you could add those few bullet points up here. So to begin with, we were looking at police referrals in 2018 and 2019. And it's really important to note that although cite and release was available to police officers in 2017 for the Dallas County area, it wasn't really used that much. Actually, what was happening was a lot of these referrals were originating from arrests. So just kind of something to keep in mind that cite and release was available, but not actually used all that much. So we're focusing more on referrals, specifically in 2018 and 2019. And we will look into a little bit beyond, but the main focus of the original study was those 2 years. We focused only on Class A or Class B marijuana possession since District Attorney Crusoe's policy focused on low-level marijuana possession cases. And then also just to note the kind of population information that we use come from the 2018 and the 2019 American Community Survey, which is housed by the US Census Bureau. Next slide, please. So we're going to break down how we looked at everything into a couple of pieces. And this kind of combines a few of our reports if you've had a chance to check them out. So in terms of looking at changes in referral volume, let's chat a little bit about the research methods that we used. So in terms of metrics, there's a couple of different points that we looked at. It's not just volume in terms of the number of cases, and by cases, I mean referrals, but also comparison to your population of Dallas County and the municipalities that make it up, but also racial disparity. So these are the kind of looks that we're looking for. When we talk about volume, we're simply talking about the number of cases referred for prosecution by a Dallas County arresting agency to the Dallas County DAs. I know that's a lot of Dallas County, but it becomes relevant. When we talk about racial disparity, when we flip to more of the racial disparity numbers, I'll dig in a little bit more about the metrics that we used for that, but just know that it's coming. But just to kind of give you an idea of the kind of changes we're looking at. So in, if you could add a few more bullet points, Shem. In 2018 and 2019, we're not just interested in how many referrals happened in that time. We're not just interested in what was the breakdown of racial groups, but we're looking at what was the change, what happened from one year over the next. And then after 2019, we're kind of looking at what are the ongoing changes? Are things persisting? Are things changing? Do we see the county changing in any particular way? And some things to keep in mind when we talk through all these numbers is there are some really recognizable data limitations that I just kind of want to highlight to you in the beginning so we just have it in the back of our heads. One is that the number of referrals. Now I mentioned that Dallas County, and I repeated it a few times to emphasize that, in that some of the municipalities that make up Dallas County cross borders, in that one municipality might have cases that are sent to Dallas County and some might get sent to a neighboring county. This is simply because of county lines and maybe not lining up exactly with municipality lines. The reason that it's important is that when we're talking about population numbers, so when we say the population of Dallas County is X% Black people, we're talking about the county as a whole. But when we talk about municipalities, certain municipalities, we're still going to talk about the municipality as a whole, but the number of referrals we're talking about are only those sent to the Dallas County District Attorney's Office. In addition, when we're talking about racial information, unfortunately, we were only able to break down the numbers into two distinct groups. So the first group we're going to see is really our group of interest is individuals who identify as Black. However, we would have wanted to break down our second group, which unfortunately is simply called non-Black, into other racial categories. For instance, Asian American, Hispanic, other types of groups would have been preferred to be broken down. Unfortunately, the way that Hispanic individuals are labeled is honestly sporadic and inaccurate at best. So to kind of get you the best, clearest results, it was better to split it simply Black versus non-Black. So those are some limitations just to kind of keep in the back of your head. But in terms of key findings, when we're talking about the change in volume, so again, we're looking at 2018 to 2019, how many cases are happening? Shem, if you want to add this content. So in terms of 2019, we broke it down into a couple of time periods. And that's why it's important to understand why Shem brought you that timeline was distinct things are happening at different points in time during 2019. We can look at it just simply as 2018 to 2019, and that gives us some understanding of what's going on. And we do that as well. But in order to understand how these policies interplay with each other and what pieces each change might be attributed to, we broke it down by these time periods. So for this time, the first time period is right before any of the policies are announced. So this is the time right after District Attorney Crusoe takes office, but before any formal marijuana policy is in place. Police actually increased the number of marijuana referrals that they sent to the district attorney's office by about 8%. But when we get to the next time period, this is when the marijuana non-prosecution policy is announced in February and it's in place. And the time period between that February date till about midsummer, we see that there's a 24% decline in the number of marijuana cases sent for prosecution. So again, we're starting to see a clear decrease. And then finally, when we're looking at the end part of the year of 2019, this is at the time when both the non-prosecution policy of the low-level marijuana is in effect, but also we have this laboratory report requirement. And we see that the volume of deferrals decreases even more. So at this point, we see a decline that's almost double of when just the declination policy is in effect. So originally we saw 24%, now we're seeing something around the lines of 46%. And then finally, overall, when we're putting it all together and we're looking at an annual number, we're looking at about 31% decrease in the number of referrals sent for prosecution. And again, so this piece breaks down the time period of 2019, but overall, it's about a 31% drop. I'll go next slide. So really the short version of this whole volume change is that the number of marijuana referrals significantly decreased in 2019 after the policy. Now I'm going to turn it back to Shem to kind of talk about why we think that might be happening.
Okay, so as Victoria kind of well explained about the timeline and how events have an effect on the amount of cases being referred to police. There is that huge drop between when he published his initial policy, which only said that we're going to decline prosecution for first-time offenders for Class A and Class B misdemeanors, versus the policy that went into effect later that year following the passage of the Texas hemp law, and that greater reduction in cases that were being referred for prosecution. And the question is, what caused that big reduction? The policies were in place, but what about his requirement of police following the passage of the hemp law correlated to such a huge drop in cases? And that's a question we want to keep in mind. Before we get into that, so we wanted to kind of break down a little more of how these policies were received by the various agencies in Dallas County. And this graphic depicts that. From the period of February 7th through July 21st, 2019, which is only when his initial policy was in place, the non-prosecution policy for Class A and Class B misdemeanors for first-time offenders, you see how that policy affected the arrest rates in the various police agencies in Dallas County. You see that Dallas County had zero change, but you see places like Grand Prairie and Richardson beginning to drop as the policy is in place. And then this next graphic depicts the drop in arrest rates after the hemp law related policy was instituted. And here you see even greater reductions in arrests. So Dallas County is finally on the board with 25% fewer arrests. But then Garland and Mesquite, for instance, have almost gotten to 100% no arrests for marijuana-related offenses, at least for misdemeanor-related offenses. And the big takeaway from this is that the police response was not uniform. You see that some jurisdictions continue to make arrests, whereas others almost completely negated the arrests that were making for marijuana-related offenses. So when John Creuzot, the DA, released his press release related to his first policy, which was the non-prosecution of Class A and Class B misdemeanors, he kind of couched it in terms of racial disparity, or at least that was the litmus for his policy, in that African Americans use marijuana at the same rates as other races, and yet they are disparately impacted by arrests and prosecution for that use and possession. And in the next slides, I think Victoria will be talking about how that really played out in terms of the policy. Was racial disparity impacted by his policies? So back to you, Victoria.
Awesome. So now we're going to talk about racial disparity. We've set the tone in terms of changes in the number of referrals, but now we need to think about, okay, that's referrals overall. How does this impact Black versus non-Black groups? So on the next slide, we're going to look at some volume changes, kind of just to set the stage here. So just so you know, the numbers on here are the average monthly referrals, simply because if we tried to put on every single referral on this page, it would probably take about 8 of these slides. There's a lot more cases here. But just wanted to kind of give you the idea that in both the non-Black and the Black groups, we're seeing a decrease in the number of referrals. So it's not that one racial group is getting decreases and one is not. They both are seeing decreases. The difference is the number of them and how that kind of relates to each other. So from the non-Black group, in 2018, we're seeing a decrease of about 87 cases per month. However, in the Black group, we're seeing about a decrease of 83 cases. So on the next slide, what we're going to talk about is what that means in terms of overrepresentation, and then we'll kind of get into what this means as a risk ratio. So in Dallas County, Black people are far more likely than non-Black people to be referred for prosecution for marijuana possession. So when we look at the county population, and this is a 2018 number, they really don't change from 2018 to 2019 when you look at these numbers, but Black people make up about 23% of the county's population. However, they're accounting for about 54% of the referrals in 2018. So this sets kind of like that baseline, like what's that baseline level of disparity, we would say, that set the stage for District Attorney Creuzot's non-prosecution policy. Now, we established that post-reform, the number of cases went down, but that doesn't necessarily mean that racial disparity was going to change. So in 2019, what we see below here is that Black people continue to make up about 56% of the referrals for marijuana prosecution. So now that we know that the number overall decreased, we know that each racial group both saw decreases. Their actual decreases in reference to each other wasn't exactly the same either. So overall in 2019, Black people continued to experience overrepresentation in the pool of marijuana referrals. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about some metrics that we did. Like I said, we come back to it, which includes a couple of different concepts that kind of group together to give you what is called a risk ratio. So a risk ratio combines county population, it combines referral volume, and then it gives you that added bonus of computing the relativeness between these two groups. So now it's not just are Black people overrepresented in the pool, it's how do they compare to non-Black people as well. So what this kind of statistic does is it really measures the disproportion in the number of Black people referred for prosecution when comparing it to the number of non-Black people referred. And the population the population baseline we're using is the 5-year estimate of that American Community Survey from 2018. So that kind of sets the population level. And then how to kind of calculate this number. And if you want more details, we can dig in, but I'm going to give you the general basis and how to interpret it going forward. But we're going to calculate it by calculating the risk of referral for Black people. So this risk is calculated as you're going to divide the number of Black people referred by the number of Black people in the population. So this is your risk out of your population of Black individuals that reside in Dallas County. What's your risk in comparison to your own racial group of being referred for prosecution? Then we're going to do the same exact calculation for our non-Black group. So now we have two risks kind of going side by side. Then to kind of get that idea of how they kind of compare together, what's the relativeness between the two groups? How do I compare how one group phases against another? We are going to divide the Black group risk by the non-Black group risk. So the kind of concept that we're going to talk about, it's called relative likelihood of referral. And the way to interpret this is that if the calculation came out to 1, so if in my perfect world, my calculation would be the number 1, which would indicate to me that there's actual complete equality. There's the same level of risk for a Black individual and a non-Black individual of being referred for prosecution. So 1 is kind of like the ideal world. If the number is greater than 1, anything greater than 1, then that kind of tells you that Black people are X times more likely than non-Black people to be referred for prosecution. So this is where you're getting that idea of the non-Black group kind of serves as that baseline, and then either the Black group has more of a chance of being referred, or they might have less of a chance, but really in the ideal world, you're hitting at 1. But however, we know that's an ideal world and that doesn't always shake out. So on the next slide here, when we actually did all these calculations and we did the math here, in 2018, Black people were 4 times more likely to be referred for prosecution compared to their non-Black counterparts. But in 2019, we're seeing it increase to 4.4. So this is telling you as the county as a whole, we're going from a 4 times more likely to a 4.4 times more likely. In essence, although the number of cases are coming down, the disparity between the two groups is not improving. In essence, it's kind of showing a little bit of a worsening effect. So on the next slide, wanted to point out again why this matters in terms of volume. So as Shem mentioned before, we see these two municipalities, Garland and Mesquite, that are almost hitting 100%, no more cases being filed. So when we calculate the risk ratio, it's going to take into account the volume of the referrals and what your presence is in the population. When we look at this, we're seeing that there's 2 municipalities that basically said that by the end of the year, they're not sending any more cases. Now, it's not that they're going to be, the risk ratio is going to turn out to 1 in the end, because remember, this is a point in time. It's only a chunk of 2019. However, the risk ratios kind of calculate that entire year. So it kind of makes the story a little foggy. But on the next slide, like we said, at the end of the year, they're looking at almost no cases. And what this kind of means is that when you have almost no cases left, and on the next slide, I want to break it down by Garland and Mesquite. On this next slide here, you'll see that at the end of the year in Garland, you have 7 referrals, of course, over the course of 5 months. And in Mesquite, we see 24. So I could calculate a risk ratio. I could say a certain population, there is X percentage of Black individuals of the full population referrals. But now you're getting into numbers that are so small, it's almost meaningless to say that there is a big, huge difference in the racial groups when there's barely any cases. And at the end, I believe the last month of the year, there was actually 0. There's nothing to compare to. So what it indicates is that when you get to 0, when you stop sending cases to the district attorney's office to prosecute, not only are you accomplishing the goals of the policy to decrease the numbers of marijuana possession cases, so you're decreasing the volume, you're eliminating the case, but but you're effectively also tackling the racial disparity question, because when there's no cases, there's nothing to compare and there's nothing to say there's disparate impact. So on the next slide, just to kind of reemphasize the takeaways here, is we pointed out 2 municipalities that really took the policy changes and really went with it. They really followed it and they went all the way to 0. However, that doesn't mean every municipality followed the same course. In fact, we found that some police departments increased their level of disparity despite maybe dropping their numbers. And then there was also quite a few police departments that were able to tackle some of the racial disparity and get it a little bit improved, but again, not quite hit that equality #1 risk ratio number. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Shem to talk about some implementation.
Hello again. So as far as declination rates, you see that in 2018, we weren't tracking that number, but in 2019, 2020, and 2021, you see declination rates increase, and the declination rates within the prosecutor's office. So 80% of cases declined in 2019, and that number only increases as John Crusoe's tenure goes along during his first term. All right, so I'm here to talk about why it worked, or why we think it works. So the first one is preparation. The ground was prepared for this kind of policy to work in this environment. Notwithstanding the acceptance of marijuana use nationwide, Dallas County had already begun going into a program of not non-prosecution, but certainly alternative prosecution. Under Faith Johnson, he might still have been accepted under the elements of the offense, for having meeting the elements of the offense, but cite and release was widely encouraged. And in our office, you're seeing things more like conditional dismissals, which results in that huge number of thousands of dismissals relative to the number of new cases. The next thing is a written policy. John Crusoe obviously sent memos to police departments, but also made press releases to the community to explain policies. But also within his own office, the policies were going to be circulated, and meetings with the relevant sections of his office were held in which they could ask him questions as to why this policy or what was going on with his policy. But more, the big takeaway is the policy was communicated not only to law enforcement, but also to the community and then within his own office. And the last one is constraint. Now, this is something we didn't talk about earlier. However, in constraints, in his office his office is a horizontal office. I mean, there is an intake unit and then there's a separate trial section. But for marijuana cases within his office, they're only handled by one person. One person receives all the marijuana cases in the intake unit, and that person is the one who decides whether to charge or decline based on the criteria of the case. And whereas, as opposed to like the drug section of the intake unit or the misdemeanor section of the intake unit, where the multiple prosecutors are there, only one person is there, and only one person has to wholeheartedly believe the policy to ensure that it's implemented correctly. So he has a gatekeeper in his intake section that controls the marijuana cases that actually flow into the office past that point. So the limitations that we see are that it's not permanent. Obviously, this policy can only be alive so long as John Crusoe remains district attorney in Dallas County. That's not to say that another DA won't take up the mantle, but that's by no means a guarantee. The other one is that it doesn't bind police. As you can see, some departments got on board and have gotten to nearly 100% of no referrals to the DA's office, whereas others kind of have a mixed bag on that. His policy itself did not constrain police, nor could it, from making lawful arrests. And then we have our unknowns. We don't know what other offenses were charged when arrests were made for marijuana. And we also don't know what number of cases might have been referred to the community courts for prosecution as opposed to being referred to the county courts based on arrests being made. And back to Pam.
Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up with a little current context, and Shem will just walk through them one by one. The political landscape, I think it's not a secret that there's been a tremendous backlash, particularly in the last couple of years, to this idea of quote unquote progressive prosecution, and it has often been expressed in the political landscape as rogue prosecutors, prosecutors defying legislators, et cetera. Most recently here in Texas, we've seen the introduction of a bill that would allow the Attorney General to seek the removal of a district attorney for having either a formal or informal non-prosecution policy based in part on merely the data coming out of the office on which cases they prosecute and don't prosecute. You've seen similar efforts in California, Florida, Virginia. But I want to stress here that this is not new. There are those on this webinar, besides just me, I think, who will remember, for example, when Rob Johnson, who was a relatively progressive prosecutor in the Bronx many, many years ago, in the 1990s, announced that he wouldn't prosecute capital cases. There was a police officer shot and killed in the Bronx, and George Pataki, who was then the governor of New York, sent in the Attorney General to prosecute it as a capital case because the district attorney locally had declined. There was a litigation over this issue. So these are not new, although I think they feel new because the context of criminal justice reform has changed so much. Second, I want to talk about transparency. One of the things that has been very different about these new progressive prosecutors has been the level of transparency about their non-prosecution policies. They're putting them in writing, not simply to police, not simply to their office, but they are frequently publishing them. What that means is you can have not simply the kind of conversation we're having, but you can have public accountability conversations. Those same transparent conversations are the fodder for the political landscape. So I think it's a complicated conversation to understand whether the transparency, which one I think can view as a civic good, is backfiring in terms of this push to constrain prosecutorial discretion. I also want to touch on this idea of populism here, and I'm making a little bit of a reference to Professor Carol Murray's paper. He writes about populist prosecutorial nullification, but I want to kind of go broad on this and say that when a prosecutor announces, enacts, and enforces in a very transparent way a non-prosecution policy, or for that matter, a full prosecution policy, what they are doing is essentially putting their policies up for democratic vote to the extent that people show up for prosecutor elections. And I realize that's an issue. But that can cut both ways. So some on this webinar may have read Tanya Tetlow's work about discriminatory acquittals. I think the same can be said for discriminatory non-prosecution, prosecutors who simply don't prioritize things that the community does care about or that we might wish they care about. You can look at many of the civil rights violations in the late 1950s and early 1960s, which later the federal government had to come back and prosecute. Those were declination policies, albeit informal, that white people suspected of killing Black people demonstrating for civil rights would not be prosecuted. So I think the populism question in terms of the way it plays out with these non-prosecution policies is something to keep an eye on. At the same time, there are these democratic norms that I think are deeply threatened when we see states threatening to take away local autonomy. So if we think about concentric circles of democracy, in many places, I would argue perhaps in most places in the nation, the elected local prosecutor probably has the most profound effect as a democratically elected official on what goes on in their criminal justice system. And when you think about states coming in to take over, there's a way in which that's the flattening of a fundamentally local government function, which is to reflect the community's priorities. A couple of other consequences that I want to point out that will come if district attorneys are constrained in their express and formal use of discretion. And I stress that because the reality is that no district attorney can prosecute every case that lands on their desk. There are all kinds of discretionary decisions they make, starting with, is there in fact probable cause? But many of those are short of a declination policy. But if prosecutors are forced or feel forced to take every case that lands in their lap, the power of making discretionary choices really pushes upstream. It pushes upstream, and the power about what will be prosecuted is essentially delegated to police. In a hypothetical world where prosecutors accept and move forward with every case that comes in the door, they've lost the discretionary power that normally resides in prosecutors, and essentially police now control the decision about who will be prosecuted, subject only to a probable cause constraint. The other thing I want to point out, and this is where Shem started, is that the discretion will not go away. We know that. We saw this happening with the federal sentencing guidelines. Discretion didn't go away. It just moved farther downstream. So what happens if governments are successful either formally or with kind of political threats and constraining a formalized, principled use of prosecutorial discretion with certain categories of cases? What will happen is the same value will be placed on those cases. No one is going to change their opinion about marijuana cases because of pressure in that regard. What you'll see is the cases are going to go back to the way they looked, for example, before John Creuzot took over, when you had thousands and thousands of cases being dismissed. And the dismissal, the downstream shift, has enormous human consequences. Not only are you looking probably at increased arrest rates, maybe not, but you're talking about judicial time, prosecutor time, defender time, court time, bailiff time, incarceration days that are essentially a reflection of the same discretion having been displaced from an earlier stage, which I think is the optimal stage, downstream to a later one. So those are my kind of quick thoughts about some implications. And with that, I think we want to open it up to questions and comments from the group. The only other thing I forgot to say clearly was that there's a takeaway. And the takeaway is that there are organizational and political limitations to these declination policies. Shem mentioned a couple of them, one being the difference between horizontal offices and vertical offices, right? In a horizontal office with a charging unit, it's relatively easy to make sure that everyone's following a policy. Much harder to do the more diffuse that charging power is, but also these very, very real political limitations. And here I don't mean the limitation of the voters don't like it, they will vote you out. I mean the political limitations of an increasingly vigorous effort to constrain the use of prosecutorial discretion, which I deeply believe all that's really going to do is discourage transparency and push the discretionary decisions farther downstream. So now I get to turn it open to the audience for questions. So if you are out there, I would ask that you please put your cameras on. You don't have to, but once the PowerPoint's over, it's genuinely kind of depressing to be talking to blank screens. So we would love to hear your questions. You can put them in the chat or you can raise your hand and someone will call on you, probably me if I can figure out how to get to where I can see you all. But we'd love to talk about your thoughts either about the data and what we've uncovered in Dallas County or about kind of the future of where these prosecutorial discretion efforts are going. You know, many of you are seeing this in your own home jurisdictions right now. So I have one question that just came in, which is, what do we think it looks like now? In other words, is it going to continue? And I don't know whether that's kind of a question generally directed at the marijuana per se or the discretion. Victoria, can you talk about a little bit about what we've seen with the marijuana declinations and explain why we may see an increase in acceptances based on the policy?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of a potential increase, one way I could see it happening is the policy was meant to focus on first-time offenses. So in theory, if someone came in for the first time and got their case declined, when they come in the second time, maybe in 2020, 2022, later on, their case isn't going to get declined anymore. It might be accepted. So that would probably be the most likely reason why more acceptances might come through. In terms of continued outlook on that sense, that doesn't mean it's changing all that much in terms of the number of declinations that the office is still enforcing. So as we saw on that one graph that Shem had up, in 2018, the office had less than 1% of these cases declined. So as we talked about before, we're seeing tons and thousands of dismissals, but only about 1% of those cases are getting declined from the outset. But then we saw those huge shift where we saw almost 80%, up to 95% in 2020 of those cases were declined. And so we're seeing basically at least 80% kind of being hit from that point forward. but that doesn't mean cases aren't still being sent. We are still seeing cases being sent in 2020 and 2021 and 2022. Police are still sending these cases to the office for prosecution.
And I think it's probably worth taking a second to talk about, again, why that might be, that the declination policy has not achieved kind of 100% reflection in the policing practice. So to put that another way, the office at this point, we're pretty confident has over a 90% compliance rate with its own internal policy, meaning they are consistently and pervasively declining to prosecute cases that satisfy the criteria set out in the policy. And yet police continue to bring those cases. Sometimes they are bringing them because someone's been picked up on another offense and they had marijuana on them, and so the police are throwing that in there, in which case it's a tag along. But there are still cases coming in where the only reason that someone's been arrested and therefore booked, right, taken off the street, strip searched, all of those things are happening where it is simply a marijuana charge. And I don't know that we have a great answer. We're not a policing shop. What I can tell you is that even given the diffuse nature of the policing responses that Shem talked about, it's not a secret anymore that these cases won't be accepted. And I see that as an underscoring of the theory I mentioned earlier, which is that the less discretion there is, the more power reverts to police. And so what I mean there is, presumably, if you were a police officer and because you've submitted lots and lots of cases that have been declined for prosecution, that this case is also going to be declined. I think there's a reasonable inference that the purpose of the arrest is the temporary punishment that goes along with the arrest and the booking, rather than any meaningful attempt to bring a case to the prosecutors because you believe it will be prosecuted. That might have been going on at the beginning, where police were still figuring out what was the policy, how was it being applied. But I think it's difficult to understand now what would be the basis, the good faith basis for arresting somebody on a marijuana first offense. Now, there might be police officers who are not sure, is it in fact someone's first time? But I think it's very hard to understand the principled basis for a marijuana misdemeanor arrest that's a marijuana misdemeanor only. Shem, do you want to add anything on that?
I mean, like Pam's kind of already mentioned, we just don't know like what decision-making process is going on when the police makes that arrest. It could be that they just want to flout the policy and deliver the punishment that an arrest and a booking does inflict on a person who's charged with a crime, irrespective of where it winds up in disposition. But with especially in Dallas County, I've begun thinking about why. Like, why had there been not such a dramatic effect in the number of arrests being made, like versus Garland and Mesquite, where there were huge decreases in arrests being made for marijuana first-time offense of marijuana possession. And then I just begin wondering, again, we're not a police shop, so I don't want to, go down this rabbit hole of, where they're policing. I know Dallas has a hotspot policing program in place right now that they're trying to decrease violent crime in the city. And by virtue of that program, is that what's leading? Is that program like having collateral consequences, that's allowing for individuals to continue to be arrested for something that police know will not be prosecuted, but it still meets the goals of a hotspot policing program in the city?
So I don't know if we can find it, but we have a slide. Victoria, maybe you can look for it online, but we actually looked at that hotspot problem. In the summer of 2019, there was in fact an increased policing presence in Southern Dallas, predominantly African-American neighborhood, and the police made thousands of stops in that neighborhood. And we saw that alone account for some of the volume of cases that were being brought in by police. Dallas County counts for about 50% of the marijuana cases that were coming in that year. And that one policing spike accounts for a hefty chunk of it. Victoria, do you have that handy? If not, it's okay.
So essentially it was around the summertime of 2019, the Department of Public Safety troopers were sent to the city of Dallas to kind of police the area. And I think, again, as Shem kind of was talking about, not necessarily sent there to focus on marijuana by default. By being there, they're seeing more things.
I just want to add to that point though. So when the hemp law was passed in summer of 2019, and a bunch of DAs in the state came out and made press announcements indicating they would not be prosecuting crimes anymore or marijuana anymore because of the requirement that you have to prove, beyond reasonable doubt, that the subject contraband was above 20% THC concentration. And going back to Pamela, political implications, Governor Abbott said to DPS that you will continue to make arrests for marijuana irrespective of where these offenses occur and irrespective of the DA's policy related to the offense in that particular jurisdiction.
So yeah, and so what you can see here is that there are two different lines here. Arrests are actually literally the arrests. Referrals are the cases being actually sent over to the Dallas County DA's office. The state troopers are making the arrest. The Dallas City Police are responsible for sending them over. So what's happening is the troopers are arresting. The City of Dallas Police, there's a lag in when they're sending them over to the DA's office. There's a paperwork issue that nobody here really cares about. And you can see the referrals spike all the way up here. So one, it's absolutely true that individual policing choices, I mean, it's not rocket science, drive a lot of this and drive it in some really disproportionate ways. The other thing I'd flag that I think is worth mentioning is in that gap between the first policy and the second policy. So when John Creuzot says, I'm not going to take the cases, and then his second policy, which is, I will not take the cases and I won't even look at them to tell you whether I'm going to take them or not unless you bring me a laboratory report. One thing that also changes is the cost of the lab report. To conduct the THC analysis that needed to happen, it required at that point a lab report that generally cost somewhere in the range of $200. So another way of thinking about this is that the first drop is, some departmental policy, and again, some departments that just said we're not going to do this anymore, and some departments that were not at all moved by the non-prosecution policy, but were moved by the cost to their own pocketbook of having to produce the lab report, because the result was going to be the same. Right? Any case that was declined before the lab report policy was going to be declined after the policy. The only difference was after the lab report policy went into effect, you had to pay $200 and some odd for the privilege of having the district attorney reject your case. And at that point, they submit fewer. So that's another, hypothesis about what happened here. I've got a question. Yeah.
Just to add a little more context, I was still a DA when the hemp law came out and when policies came out in effect of the hemp policy. And it wasn't always the price. I'm sure the price played a large role in it, but it was also which labs were set up to actually do a THC analysis, and not just, it's THC, but actually tell you that it was THC of above a certain concentration. Because I know that when I was still living in Oasis, we didn't have a lab that had that capability until more recently, and until the past year.
So I've got a question here that I absolutely cannot answer, but I would be happy to throw it open to anyone on this call who can answer it. And I think there's several $1 million for you if you can answer it, which is, how can we reduce arrests? And in particular, they're asking, how do you reduce arrests? Because people can be held for ICE while they're waiting for a case to be dismissed. I mean, part of my takeaway, I assume the question is in the context of DA policies. My takeaway from this is that DAs cannot reduce arrests. The only thing that can reduce arrests, and this is where Shem started, the only thing that can reduce arrests is changing the law. I mean, I'm hard pressed to think of anything else. Going once, got my $1 million check here.
I mean, not that I think this is worth $1 million, but there is the other option of cite and release. It's not being used all that much, and that doesn't necessarily mean it saves the problem. It doesn't mean it really resolves everything, but we do have other options. It's just not being used.
But this question about how do you stop arrests and people being held flags something that I think is worth stopping on for a minute, because Shem and Victoria are working on a new project in Dallas County where we're conducting a randomized controlled trial of providing a larger pool of victims with victim advocate assistance. And that project is, among other things, going to test whether giving prosecutors more information earlier about victims and their availability. Can you find the victim? Do they want to testify? Whether that will expedite the time frame in making a decision and also improve the quality of the decision. You can be held a really long time in jail before a prosecutor makes a decision on your case. In Texas, on a felony, it's 90 days in jail. And then it's 180 days total. Marijuana and misdemeanors are a little bit different. But I think it's important to be asking this question: how long does it take to make that decision? If you get arrested and it takes the DA's office 10 days to decide they're not going to prosecute, that's about as long as you might have done anyway if you've gotten you might have pled guilty and gotten time served. I mean, it's not a huge boon other than the fact that you walk away without a record. Whereas if you're making that declination decision on day one, or it's getting bounced out the door at quality control, then you're seeing opportunities for people to be released in a time frame that minimizes criminogenic effects, as well as obviously saving people's lives. Judge Shen, does that sound right to you? I mean, as a former defender?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, well, I was actually thinking about something a little bit different. To segue a little bit, if you don't mind. I was curious, and you didn't talk about this, I know this is not part of the research, but there seems to be could be a potential argument for significant cost savings, not only in the required mandatory test that John Crusoe is asking for people to do, but just in the amount of time the DAs are spending on these cases, like thousands of cases, that they could be using that time to focus on more serious matters. Has there been any thought into looking into, I'm just curious if there has been thought into looking into that, or if that has been considered in other studies?
Victoria, I'm gonna hand that to you for a second.
I'm thinking for a second. Wait, could you what exactly are you looking for? Sorry.
I'm just curious if there is like any kind of cost savings analysis that has been done. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that there's some studies out there that are looking at what's the cost on the system in terms of like prosecuting a case. So as Pam mentioned before, like what's the cost of all the actors who get involved, the time in jail, the time to house people, the amount to house people in jail, like adding up all those things. However, there just really isn't that much out there that have conclusive results, partially because there's just so many things to keep in mind. I think that really makes, if you put a dollar figure on, like if I say I could save $2,000 if I didn't prosecute this one case, it is so easy to punch holes in that, to say like, well, you forgot to include this, and you forgot to include this factor as well, which I think is partially why they just haven't been studied that much. I mean, it's definitely something to be interested in, since that might be the financial side of this whole thing, of the benefits of not prosecuting cases, but I don't think there's too much out there on that. Pam, do you feel that?
Well, I think where you'll find that literature is in the literature on pretrial release and counsel at first appearance. And Blaine, if you want to drop a note in there somewhere about our report and the one pager we did on this, I think there is some evidence that about the criminogenic effects of incarceration, that cost savings piece. Cato Institute, I think, has suggested something like a $29,000 lifetime income loss. So there are a few scattered pieces of data. But I think Judge Shen is also asking, what's the cost of judicial time, prosecutor time, bailiff time, et cetera? It's a great question. It's not something we've been funded to study, but I would love to see somebody do it. I got a great question in the chat about cite and release. And can I ask the person who, I'm not going to say your name properly. Kiri, do you want to weigh in, or you want me to read your question?
What was the question again?
I was asking you, because you asked a question. I asked if you wanted to talk about it. You asked a question about cite and release and increased warrants, and I wanted to know if you could talk about that for a minute.
Oh, certainly. So I'm actually a former police officer in DC. I live here in Dallas now. But so many times when you issue citations, which of course is a great idea, but then if you're issuing that citation to someone who doesn't have, say, steady work or just unable to pay that citation in a good length of time, then all of a sudden, when there's time for their court appearance, then they're kind of in a tough situation because it's, do I go to court and risk of having to pay a bigger fine because I can't miss work? So I think it's just a tough situation overall because, you know, as we're going through this presentation, so many of these people that fall victim to this are people that, you know, just do not have the resources to, you know, pay these citations. And then we end up running the risk of them now having warrants and now they're in a bigger situation. So it's kind of like an ongoing cycle right now until we can kind of figure something out.
Yeah, I have to say, I really appreciate you raising that. And I think it's an important thing to stop and talk about. I agree 100% that cite and release burdens people, often poor people, with the obligation of going down to court at least twice. You do end up with warrants, you end up with fines and fees. I think the larger question that the cite and release process begs is why. It reminds me a lot of the conversations we're having about criminalizing traffic offenses. But if we're really comfortable that cite and release is an appropriate way to handle these offenses, then why are we bringing them into the criminal legal system at all, given the other priorities we have? And in some ways, I think that I think that's the question, and I think I know the answer, which is that we are in a user pay system that runs off of fines and fees. And if we didn't make people pay fines and fees on everything from parking violations to low-level offenses, I don't know where we would be budget-wise. That's, I think, a piece of it. It varies on the jurisdiction, but I mean, I think it's a really important point. I don't know if other people have thoughts about cite and release.
Yeah, Pamela, I do.
Yeah.
Max Garrett. So I was there. I helped the Dallas Police Department work with the Dallas County DA's office in developing the system, the process for cite and release. And the name belies the actual things you have to do to do it. It's not what you would think of as issuing a speeding ticket. It's not just issuing the citation, citing, and go on. From a police officer's perspective, there's the records check, because you have to make sure that person, this isn't the first, or this is the first instance, and then it's not a true citation. But
you have to go to court.
From a totally utilitarian view, and not looking at it from a altruistic or a what's the public good involved in it from a total utilitarian viewpoint. If you make that equation of, is it worth my time to perform a cite and release, or make the arrest and add on another charge and take the individual to jail, for a number of officers that just made that very base level equation, it was easier from a time frame and a work perspective to make that arrest because of the time investment in that cite and release. And please don't get me wrong, I'm not making a value judgment and arguing that. I absolutely am on the side of reducing the number of arrests and for the improvement of public good. But those are some of the factors that came into cite and release and implementing that policy.
That's fascinating. Can I ask you a follow-up question?
Absolutely.
Do you have a sense of why cite and release has been used so rarely? I mean, relative to the volume of incidences where it could have been used, one of the things that I've been so surprised about is how rarely it's been used by police officers. Sure.
So it'll go back to the process. It's a cumbersome process. It's involved. It's much like, I'll equate it to DWI arrests. So if you arrest a suspect for DWI, there are a number of steps you have to take. There's a bunch of paperwork, a lot of procedural stuff, and a lot of follow-up that's required of the officer in the aftermath of that. Officers have family lives. You may not want to go to court all the time, and you may not want to deal with the subpoenas that result from those arrests. Cite and release, very similar, very, very cumbersome, very paperwork oriented, time consuming, and it a challenge to get an engagement from an officer to say this is doing something good, as opposed to putting the person in jail and going forward. If you can streamline that or eliminate that altogether, again, back to your point of how do we reduce arrest? We change the law. I give you that and agree with you on that. But other than that, streamlining the process, making it more expedient for the officer in the field and for the citizen, I think would help.
So if I understand you correctly, it's basically that actually the paperwork is sort of a barrier to entry, that that the obstacles to doing the cite and release are substantial for the officers.
The process itself is very involved. Yes.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating to know. Can I ask you another question that you may not either know or want to answer? And I'll let you take a pass.
Story of my life.
I get it. Do you have thought about what's going on with the ongoing arrests and referral for prosecutions of cases that everyone knows are going to be declined?
Without any empirical evidence, I can offer a guess. I think some of it has to do with police culture, with a conservative, and I don't want to go political, but a conservative mindset that says this law is being broken and doing drugs is bad, and so therefore I'm going to do my duty as an officer to make this arrest, because I don't believe in the liberal policies of releasing someone or not enforcing this law, and this is how I do that. This is how I take my stand as an officer to do what I was sworn to do. I think it comes down to some of that.
That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, I wonder a lot about what it means to make an arrest if you know there's not going to be a prosecution, and that was very helpful in helping me understand why someone might do that. So thank you.
You're welcome.
I see another comment here, and I think it's right. We have a comment in the chat that just says, this underscores the idea that it's really important to do the research, not just with DAs, but with police officers, and to have dialogue with police chiefs and DAs. And I guess I want to underscore that point, in that I think that the district attorney would concur that the way this policy was rolled out to the public was suboptimal. It was packaged up with some other policies that were far less popular than the marijuana policy. It drew the governor's attention. I think there was, sort of infamously, the governor tweeted that the district attorney was a socialist. I mean, there was a lot of noise around this that might, I think, in a different environment, in a different rollout, have gone kind of differently. I don't know that it always had to be that way. But I think the larger point is, understanding and improving communications and policy conversations between police and prosecutors. I think, and Shem might be able to speak more to this because he's done some research on it. There's some pretty clear indications that if you give police officers the respect of letting them understand why you're doing it and what the benefit is, because it's not just the marijuana piece. One thing I think that's missing from a lot of the conversations about progressive prosecution is, if I am not handling 6,000 marijuana cases a year, I can spend more time focusing on rapes and armed robberies and murders and child sex offenses as a prosecutor. But when I think nobody likes to be told how to do their job by somebody who doesn't do that job. Shem?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think the benefit, I know that from the interviews that y'all did with staff members of the DA's office about the rollout, even before Trudeau was DA and when Faith Johnson was DA, it was all about meetings with the community, meetings with police departments to inform them of the policy changes and how it would impact them. And I kind of just tend to feel that when people are part of the conversation, they tend to have more buy-in. I've never had to do this at the scale that they've had to do it with, getting whole police agencies on board with something they want to do. But, on a much smaller scale, speaking to victims as a prosecutor, I might do something that's maybe against the interest of what they want to say about the case. But if I bring them into the conversation and explain that to them, and they feel like they've had some buy-in and they've been heard, they're more likely to not fight you at the end of the day. And I think that's what he kind of did successfully, but maybe not so much when he rolled it out to the public. And how you need to continue to do it going forward, bring them in the conversation, allow them to be heard, they have buy-in to what eventually happens.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys both for that. It's my job to point out that we're at 3:10 and I want to be respectful of people's times. If you're interested in this topic, I want to flag for you that next month, Justin Murray, who's a professor at New York Law School, is going to be speaking on a related topic, the myth of individualized discretion. And his point is largely that prosecutors have always had policies about what they prioritize and don't, and always had policies about what they will and won't prosecute. And that there's a real mythology that somehow prosecutors are looking carefully at every case and making individualized decisions. We also have two other events coming up I just want to flag for you. Later in March, we'll have Professor Michelle Statt from the University of Minnesota speaking about place-based judging in rural areas and what it's like to be involved as a judge in a place where many people don't have a lawyer at all. On April 4th, we'll be featuring a book talk by Professor Valina Beatty, who'll be speaking about her book on wrongful convictions. And we're also running a little book club. So if you're interested in getting the book and joining our conversations about the book in advance of her visit, you can check on our website for that information. And then lastly, Malia Brink on this call somewhere will be presenting about the national workload study for public defense delivery and its implications and how one might think about implementing it. And we'll also be, so that's our April lineup. You can look for more from us for the summer and the fall. If you haven't already subscribed on our website, please do so you get notices for our events. And I really want to thank you all so much for joining us. This was incredibly helpful. It's always helpful to us to be able to think it through, but to have folks who have lived experience in these areas and can talk about what their experience is and what they know from the inside is just invaluable to us in thinking about the work. So I'm particularly grateful for those insights. So thank you all so much. And I hope we will see you either later in March or earlier in March. I think Justin's early March, and those links should be in our chat now. Yes? Yeah, so and again, please go ahead and register, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.